Hi, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to part 2 of the endocrine chapter. We're going to talk about hypothalamus hormones today. And just one thing to notice is that they all end in releasing hormone. So you can see here from the hypothalamus, we're going to have all of these releasing hormones. We're going to go through them. Don't worry about it right now. We're going to break each one down separately. And then we have the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. So we'll talk about both of these sections of the pituitary, and we'll talk about which hormones are released from which section. So more words here to kind of explain the visual that we just looked at. We know that the pituitary gland is inferior to the hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus is the W area. We're going to have this stalk that the pituitary gland hangs off of. It's pea-sized. If you remember the sella turcica, there's like a bony little projection of the sphenoid bone that protects the pituitary. And again, this should make sense to you. Anytime we're putting bone around something, it's pretty important, right? And it's partitioned into the anterior and posterior sections, just like we saw. And we're going to see different hormones are released. So from the anterior pituitary, we're going to talk about 6. And from the posterior pituitary, we're going to talk about 2 hormones that are released. With the posterior pituitary, the reason that they're 2 different sections is that they're made of different material from embryonic tissue. So the posterior part is neural. So you're going to see neurons. These neurons are going to project through the infundibulum and release hormones in the posterior pituitary. So these are going to be dumped in the blood after they exit the posterior pituitary. And there's an image coming up and make a little bit more sense. But you can see that the cell bodies or the somas are in the hypothalamus, the axons run through the infundibulum, and then the synaptic knobs, which normally we see synaptic knobs releasing neurotransmitters, the synaptic knobs within the posterior pituitary are going to release chemicals, but these chemicals are hormones because the pituitary is an endocrine organ. This image here, I think, does a nice job of showing you where the somas or cell bodies are located. It shows you the infundibulum and how the axons are moving through the infundibulum. And then you can see that the posterior pituitary, the synaptic knob ends, right? And you can see that there's 2 different clusters of neurons here. So we're going to see 2 different hormones released from the posterior pituitary. So a question that could be asked is, where are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, where are they made? Well, they're made here in the hypothalamus. Where are they secreted? They're secreted from the posterior pituitary. So this side is all, the posterior side is all nerve tissue related. The front side, we'll see that the hormones are made and secreted in the anterior pituitary. Here's our nice image. We're going to see that the hypothalamus is going to release hormones. So the hormones from the hypothalamus are going to be put in the bloodstream, and they're going to come to the anterior pituitary and cause the anterior pituitary to release these 6 hormones. So these are the hormones we're going to talk about: thyroid-stimulating hormone, prolactin, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and growth hormone. But first, let's go back and do the 2 easy ones first. So we're going to do the posterior pituitary. The first one is antidiuretic hormone. This is an amino acid hormone. It's made in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary, and it is going to decrease urine production. It's going to stimulate thirst, and it's going to constrict blood vessels. So basically, antidiuretic hormone is turned on if the solute concentration of the blood is too high. So if you have too much salt, and if you want to think of solute as salt right now, that's fine. Solute can be anything that's being dissolved, right? The item that's being dissolved. But for us right now, let's think of it as salt or sodium. So if sodium concentrations in the blood are too high, if there's too many solutes, it could be other solutes, right? Then if the water is too low and the solute is too high, antidiuretic hormone is going to kick in. You can see here I've spelled it out for you, right? So if the solute concentration is high and the water concentration is low, you're dehydrated, that's going to cause the posterior pituitary to release ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is going to target the kidney tubules. Right now, we don't know about the kidney tubules. You can just say the kidneys. So it's going to tell your kidneys to stop making urine, to reabsorb every drop of water, right? So I don't want you to think this means you're not going to urinate at all. It's basically saying stop forming urine, which is mostly water. So keep every drop of water is probably a better mindset to wrap your head around for this ADH. ADH can also cause vasoconstriction. So on the previous slide, I kind of asked about why would we have vasoconstriction if our water level is really low? So water is directly related, water is directly related to blood volume. So if your water is low, your blood volume is low. If your blood volume is low, it's harder for your blood to be pushed around to all of your extremities, right? Fingers, toes. So if we constrict the blood vessel that your blood is flowing in, it'll push the blood around faster. So basically, you have less water in your blood, you have less volume of blood, so we have to constrict the vessel to make sure that blood is making it to all of your organs, extremities, fingers, toes. If the solute concentration is low and the water is high, we have enough water. We don't need to release ADH. So think of it as there's no reason to make ADH if your water level is high enough, if your solute concentration is low enough. Alcohol does inhibit ADH. So even if you are dehydrated, right? So if you are dehydrated, but you're drinking alcohol, you're not going to release ADH even though you need to. So this is why alcohol makes us have to urinate, right? You create more urine, you don't have any ADH, it's not being triggered to be released, you're going to get rid of that urine. You're never going to inhibit urine formation. So in class, we have a hormone chart. For online, you'll have the chart listed with lab content. So the hormone chart, we kind of fill it in so that we are touching all of the points that are important to know for this hormone. So I kind of have it spelled out here for you. So what do you need to know about antidiuretic hormone? What is the stimulus trigger for it to be released? When does ADH get released? If you have high solute and low water, right? That's what dehydration means. So high solute, low water, you're dehydrated. That's going to stimulate the hypothalamus to release ADH from your posterior pituitary. So the gland that actually releases ADH is posterior pituitary. Where does ADH get made? It's actually made in the hypothalamus, right? And this is due to nerve stimulation. The target organ, mostly we're going to focus on the kidneys. The effector action, it's going to stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb water. You can see the brain to thirst connection here. If you have low water and you're dehydrated, do we want to tell the kidneys to reabsorb every drop of water? Do we want to tell the brain, hey, you're thirsty, I need to trigger that mechanism so that I need water, right? And then we're going to constrict our blood vessels so that we can continue pumping blood at a specific rate through our cardiovascular system. Throughout the PowerPoint, I'm going to have these clinical slides where we talk about if you have too much or too little of a particular hormone. So you can see here we're talking about hypersecretion of ADH. So we have hypersecretion of ADH, too much. This would be too much water reabsorbed. Right? So if you're going to have a retention of fluid, this could cause headache, disorientation. We're going to put you on some sort of fluid restriction, and we're going to monitor your sodium levels. For hyposecretion, you have low ADH secretion. It could be due to some sort of damage that's happening to the hypothalamus or the posterior pituitary. So if you never have ADH, if you don't have enough of it, you're never going to reabsorb water, even if you need to, even if you're dehydrated, right? And this causes you to be thirsty all the time. So diabetes insipidus doesn't have anything to do with insulin. It just has to do with, it's one of the symptoms of diabetes So it's called diabetes insipidus. You're constantly thirsty because even when you're dehydrated, you don't have ADH able to reabsorb water for you. So you really have to maintain your hydration level. The second posterior pituitary hormone that we're going to talk about is oxytocin. So you may have heard of the synthetic version, right? Pitocin, something we give you in childbirth. If your contractions aren't steady enough or progressing enough, we give you Pitocin to kind of boost the childbirth process. So oxytocin is the normal hormone. It's made by our hypothalamus. It's stored in our posterior pituitary, and it's going to stimulate uterine contractions. It also triggers milk ejection, and you can see how these two things would be tied together. If your uterus is contracting in order to push a baby out, once the baby comes out, you need to let the milk down that you've been making or that you are making, right, to feed the baby. So these two things are linked, and they are different than milk production. We're going to talk about prolactin in a little bit, and that is what makes the milk. Oxytocin is what triggers the milk to be released from the breast. So what's interesting is that oxytocin is also, it's a hormone, but it can also act as a neurotransmitter and signal the brain. So this is emotional bonding. This is the cuddle hormone. This also plays a role, you can see there, in sexual arousal and orgasm in males and females. So lots of functions here. We're going to kind of stick to these two. When we talk about reproduction, we'll come back and visit some of these other topics. If you're filling in your hormone chart, this kind of breaks it down nice and neat, right? Oxytocin. What's the stimulus trigger for oxytocin to be released? Uterine contractions or suckling at the breast. So the uterine contractions are going to stimulate the hypothalamus, and that hypothalamus is going to tell the synaptic knobs in the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. What's the gland that releases the hormone? Posterior pituitary. What's the target? The uterus and the breast. And what's the effector action? It stimulates uterine contraction and milk ejection. So I put down there, what type of feedback is this? So hopefully you go back to 201 topics, and we talked about negative feedback. First one is I'm hot, right? I trigger sweating, and I cool down. That's negative feedback. We were hot, now we're cooling down. This feedback is positive feedback. Are we driving all in one direction? What are we doing with these uterine contractions, right? We're trying to expel the baby, right? So the uterus is going to contract. That message goes up to the brain. And then the brain releases oxytocin, and that tells the uterus to do what? Contract again. So this is a positive feedback scenario that doesn't stop until the baby is expelled. The milk ejection part, again, you're going to have, we'll talk about it in reproduction, but you're going to have lots of oxytocin receptors made. And when the oxytocin is released, it can bind to the breast tissue receptors, and it can cause the letdown of milk. So after childbirth, and let me clarify, that's vaginal childbirth, right? If you have a C-section, you're not going to have this uterine contraction trigger, right? You'll still have the breast milk production and milk ejection. So this is a cyclical event. It's called positive feedback. Just to go back and review some of these terms from 201. I also want to mention that this is why when some women are breastfeeding, so the suckling of the breast, the releasing of oxytocin, the milk ejection, it can also, the oxytocin when you're doing the breastfeeding can also still bind to the receptors that are there in the uterus and cause uterine contractions. So some people have severe contractions of the uterus or cramping when they first start breastfeeding. And remember, the tissue can upregulate or downregulate receptors. So eventually the number of oxytocin receptors that you have on the uterus will decline, and then that will stop happening. Now we're going to move into anterior pituitary hormones. They want to make sure that you realize the hypothalamus is going to secrete a hormone. So there's going to be a hormone secreted by the hypothalamus. It's going to travel through the bloodstream, and it's going to trigger a hormone to be released from the anterior pituitary. So they'll call the hypothalamus hormones regulatory hormones. Remember, they're all going to end in some sort of releasing hormone. There are 2 inhibiting hormones, but we'll talk about those in just a minute. So here we have the hypothalamus releasing hormones: thyrotropin releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, and growth hormone releasing hormone. There are some inhibiting hormones: prolactin inhibiting hormone and growth inhibiting hormone. We'll talk a little bit about those as we move through each one of these topics. So the hypothalamus is going to release one of these hormones, and that hormone is going to trigger the anterior pituitary to release another hormone. Do you remember how we talked about hormonal stimulus? So one hormone going to another endocrine gland and causing that endocrine gland to release its hormone. So that's what we're talking about here. For the anterior pituitary, these are the hormones, the 6 that we're going to focus on. We have thyroid-stimulating hormone, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic, we have FSH and LH, and then we have growth hormone. So let's go through each one of these. With growth hormone, we're going to see growth hormone releasing hormone that turns on growth hormone, and then we're going to see growth hormone inhibiting hormone that stops growth hormone from being released. So basically you can think of this as the on switch and this as the off switch. So these 2 are released from the hypothalamus, and they either turn on the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone, or they tell the anterior pituitary to turn off growth hormone. If we're filling in the chart, this breaks it all down, right? So growth hormone releasing hormone is the stimulus trigger to release growth hormone. If you like doing a flow chart, you can do it. You can write each one of these out this way as well. Some people don't like the chart. They think it's too much information. I use it as a guide. It helped me. If it doesn't help you, that's fine. So the hypothalamus is going to release growth hormone releasing hormone. That's going to go to the anterior pituitary and cause the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. So what's the stimulus trigger for growth hormone? Growth hormone releasing hormone. What's the gland that releases growth hormone? Anterior pituitary. What's the target? Where does this growth hormone go once it's released from the anterior pituitary? Growth hormone will bind receptors in bone, muscle, cells, liver, adipose. I know this is kind of a catch-all. I'm just saying there's more than just bone, muscle, liver, and adipose tissue. So everything has to grow, right? From the time that you're born to the time that you reach adulthood, you're going to need to grow into whatever your DNA says, right? If you're 6 foot tall, right, where you need to have, bone and muscle that accommodates that frame. So what's the effect or action? I don't want to get too much into the growth factors. I mean, they do what they say, right? We're going to see an increase in growth. We're going to see protein synthesis. We're going to see cells dividing, basic cell growth. So if you want to just say cell growth, that's fine. I would also be thinking a little bit about protein synthesis, right? So if a cell is growing, you're going to have to make proteins as those cells divide. You can't just keep splitting a cell and not make anything, right? You'd run out of mitochondria and a nucleus and DNA. You got to copy everything if you're going to continue to grow and do mitosis. So critical thinking point here, why do we have to target the liver and adipose? What does the liver store that we need in order to grow? And what does adipose tissue store that we need for fast energy, right? So I just want to make sure that we're putting the link in there that in order to grow, we also need fuel. Some terms that I would kind of get familiar with are glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, glycogenesis. I know we don't like these terms. They're confusing, but if you break each one of them down, it's pretty easy, right? So glycogen is stored glucose. So what's lysis? Breakdown. So what does glycogenolysis do? It breaks down glycogen into individual glucoses. What is glycogenesis? Creating glycogen. If I have one glucose and another glucose and I want to store it in the liver for later, I'm going to store it in the liver as glycogen. Back when we talked about carbohydrates, we mentioned stored body glucose as glycogen. Lipolysis, break down triglycerides. Lipogenesis, we're going to store fat, right? Triglycerides. Gluconeogenesis is a new term, and we'll talk about it more when we get to the adrenal gland, but you can make glucose out of non-carbohydrate sources. And I know that sounds crazy right now. Basically what we're saying is we can alter other nutrients in the body and turn them into glucose so that we can make ATP. So hopefully we can go back to cellular respiration and realize that you need oxygen and glucose. I'm going to kind of change how I'm writing this because I don't want to write out carbon dioxide. So you want to make sure that you have enough free glucose in order to make ATP, especially if you need to grow, right? Here we can see hypersecretion and hyposecretion. So if you have increased growth hormone, if you're a child, it's going to cause gigantism. If you're an adult, they call it something different, acromegaly. You're the correct size, but it does cause internal organ to increase in size and release of glucose. And again, high blood sugar is not really good for your kidneys. For hyposecretion, so if you have low amounts of growth hormone in children, that's going to result in pituitary dwarfism. So this is not the same thing as achondroplasia, which is a genetic condition that causes dwarfism. So there's something wrong with the growth hormone that should be secreted from your anterior pituitary. So now we're going to move on to each individual hormone. Here we have thyroid-stimulating hormone, TSH. This hormone is stimulated by thyrotropin-releasing hormone. So thyrotropin-releasing hormone, which comes from the hypothalamus, that is going to cause the anterior pituitary to release TSH, and TSH is going to go to the thyroid and cause the thyroid to release thyroid hormones. So hypothalamus releases TRH. That targets the anterior pituitary to release TSH, and that targets the thyroid to eventually release thyroid hormones. Next up is adrenocorticotropic hormone. So adrenocorticotropic hormone is stimulated to be released by CRH, corticotropic releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus. So again, I have the hypothalamus, which releases CRH. That travels to the anterior pituitary and causes the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. ACTH is going to go to the adrenal cortex. We have to be specific here. Cortex means the outer section. There is also a medulla, which means middle, and there are different hormones that are secreted from the medulla. So we have to be specific and say ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to release hormones, corticosteroids. So the hypothalamus is going to release CRH. Anterior pituitary is going to release ACTH. ACTH is going to go to the adrenal cortex. And what's the adrenal cortex going to release? It's going to release corticosteroids. We're going to talk about what those are on part 3. So this kind of looks similar to when we did thyroid, right? We have a releasing hormone that triggers an anterior pituitary hormone that goes to a gland and causes another endocrine gland to release a hormone. I also want to mention stress. So another trigger for this hormone is stress. So if you're under a lot of stress, you can release more CRH, release more ACTH. So stress is also a factor for releasing ACTH. Gonadotropins, I really should have a bracket up here that says FSH and LH. They fall under the same category of gonadotropins. So these are stimulated by GnRH. So the hypothalamus is going to release GnRH. That's going to go to the anterior pituitary and cause the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. These are both going to go to gonads. And when I say gonads, hopefully we know this could mean ovaries or testes, right? So this is ovary, testes. We just kind of lump them together. What is it going to cause the ovaries and testes to do? Two different things. So follicle stimulating hormone produces gametes, egg or sperm, where luteinizing hormone causes the ovaries and testes to release hormones. So to make clear, FSH in a female is going to trigger ovulation, creation, the egg being released from the ovary. LH is going to cause the release of estrogen and progesterone. In males, FSH is going to stimulate the production of sperm. LH is going to stimulate the production of testosterone. So when you're filling out your chart, a lot of the boxes will be the same, but once you get to effector action, right? So this is the effector action, you're going to have to spell out that FSH and LH do something different. But up until that point, what's the stimulus trigger for both FSH and LH? GnRH. What's the target organ for FSH and LH? They both are going to target the gonads, either the ovary or the testes, depending if it's male or female. So once you get to effector action is when you have to actually delineate. Our final anterior pituitary hormone here, we have prolactin. You can mention both lower prolactin inhibiting hormone or PRH release. Both of those can be the trigger or the stimulus for prolactin to be released. We really started off talking about releasing hormones, so I think PRH makes sense. But there is another mechanism of control, this prolactin inhibiting hormone. If you have lots of inhibiting hormone, prolactin isn't released. So if you want to mention both, that's fine. We're kind of going to stick with the releasing hormones. We're kind of just doing the basics with this course. If you're going to be a lactation specialist, then yes, you will have to know the difference and which controls which and all the ins and outs, right? But for right now, if you want to say PIH or prolactin releasing hormone, so low PIH or prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is what triggers prolactin to be released from the anterior pituitary, that's fine. What's the target organ? Hopefully we know this is breast tissue, and what does it do? It stimulates milk production. Go back and review the fact that we need two hormones in order to make sure that milk production continues. So with the posterior pituitary, we have oxytocin, which is the letdown of the milk. And with the anterior pituitary, we have the prolactin, which actually creates the milk. So you need both of these working in order for milk production to continue. The last gland that we're going to talk about is the thyroid. And we're going to talk about several hormones that are released from the thyroid gland. You can see here, this is really just showing you where it's located. And does it make sense that there's a lot of blood vessels, right? So your thyroid is going to, there we go. Thyroid is going to dump T3 and T4, these are thyroid hormones, into the bloodstream, and they're going to travel throughout the body. So they're just showing you that there's a right and a left lobe. Do you know that this is inferior to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx? It's anterior to the trachea, so it's in front of the trachea, but it's below the thyroid where the larynx is, where your voice box is, where your vocal cords are. For the anatomy of the thyroid, we have this microscope image. It's also the one that I put up for part 1, right? So this circle, the outer ring, these cells, those are follicular cells. And inside is called the colloid. It's kind of like a holding tank, right? It does have fluid, but we'll see that this is where we assemble T3s and T4s. And then we have para, which means next to. So this clump of cells that do not make up the follicle, they're not part of the follicular cells. These parafollicular cells are going to make calcitonin. So parafollicular cells are going to make calcitonin, and these follicular cells and the colloid are going to assemble T3 and T4, which are thyroid hormones. If you want to walk through the steps, you can. I think kind of just take a look, take a step back, take a look at this, and kind of follow the pathway of each of these individual pieces that have to come together to make T3 and T4. So here's the term, triiodоthreonine, right? Tetraiodоthreonine. I'll try saying that really fast, right? So iodine goes in, it's iodide, it's negatively charged. It travels through, two of them come together, we now have iodine. So what is this? This is the follicular cell. So they're trying to show you that this is follicular cell and this is the colloid. So iodide travels across the follicular cell into the colloid and it's transformed into iodine. Then we have this cell. How do I know this is a cell? Do you see rough ER, Golgi apparatus? This cell is making this protein, which is thyroglobulin. So the colloid is going to assemble these two things, this protein, thyroglobulin, these iodines, and it's going to make MITs and DITs. I love the name, mono, right, di. So if I take 2 thyroglobulins and I add 1, 2, 3 iodines, that's a T3. If I take 2 thyroglobulins and I add 4 iodines, that's T4. So all of this assembly is happening in the colloid, and we're going to package it in a vesicle, and we're going to diffuse it across into the bloodstream. In thinking about the regulation of thyroid hormone, what are some ways that would trigger more thyroid hormone to be released, right? Why would we need more T3 and T4 in which particular situations? So you can see them listed here. If it's cold outside, we're going to generate more T3 and T4 to help increase our metabolism. Remember, every time that we're breaking something down, we're generating heat, right? Anytime we take ATP and use it in some way, we're also generating body heat. So cold temperature, pregnancy, high altitude, probably something to do with oxygen, right? And you need to make sure that you're increasing your metabolism. If your oxygen levels are low, you need to increase the amount of ATP that you need, right? If you don't have enough sugar. So again, I could go back and draw, do our glucose and oxygen are the 2 reactants that go into the process of making ATP, and you need ATP in order to do metabolism. So if you don't have enough oxygen or you don't have enough glucose, that's going to trigger more T3 and T4 production. So TRH causes the anterior pituitary to release TSH. So remember, this comes from hypothalamus. It's going to trigger the anterior pituitary to release more TSH. The TSH is going to bind to receptors of the follicular cell, and it's going to trigger more T3 and T4 thyroid hormone to be released. So another thing to think about is, why do we have 2 different forms? Why do we have a T3 and a T4? Usually if you have redundancy, it means that it's important. So T3 versus T4. The thyroid produces more T4 than T3, but T3 is more active. So let's say it's 20% T3 and it's 80% T4 is what comes out of the thyroid. T3 is active right now. T4 can be converted. Remember, all we have to do is pull off an iodine, right? And now we're T3. So T4 can be converted to T3, and I think of this as later, right? What are some of the things that T3 and T4 can do? They're going to go to all body cells, right? So T3 and T4, the target organ is all body cells. And it's going to tell all the body cells to increase metabolism. You're going to see an increase in amino acid uptake and glucose uptake. You're going to see increased cellular respiration enzymes. These are proteins, right? Enzymes are proteins being made. So what are the cells getting ready to do? What is all of this T3 and T4 going to do to the body cells? The cells are going to increase the buildup and breakdown, right? They're going to increase ATP production. So hopefully, why within the mitochondria? We know that this is the site of cellular respiration. This is where we turn the majority of our glucose into ATP. So I think it's 34 ATPs are generated from mitochondria, and then the others are outside in the cytoplasm, right? Just from glycolysis. So what else does thyroid hormone do? So it's increasing ATP production, right? It's breaking down glycogen into individual glucoses. It's going to create glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. We're going to increase lipolysis, right? We're going to save glucose for the brain. Your brain likes glucose exclusively. We're going to increase our breathing, right? So that we can have more oxygen. We're going to increase blood flow so that we can have more nutrients getting to individual cells, right? Increase heart rate, force of contraction, increase epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will also help us increase blood flow. So thyroid hormone is critical for lots of other bodily functions. So hypersecretion, if we have too much T3 and T4, so increased amount of T3 and T4, the first two don't sound so bad, increased metabolic rate and weight loss. But you're going to have hyperactivity. So thyroid-stimulating hormone is going to make your cells just work all the time, right? You could also have nervous cell transmission issues, right? So too much thyroid hormone, not good. Also, remember, if you increase your metabolic activity, you're constantly breaking down food sources that also generates body heat, right? So when you change energy from one form to another, some of it is always lost as heat. So your internal body temperature is higher. You're not able to tolerate extreme heat as much. So there are some things that we could talk about here, critical thinking, what's happening in the pituitary, how does this affect the thyroid, and what's the treatment for this? Removing the thyroid is basically the only treatment for this overactive. I think they can do irradiation of the cells to stop them from excessively producing if it's something that's particular to the thyroid. So kind of just follow with me real quick for a second. We're going to do a case study in class. If you're taking an online class, I'll assign the case study. But if you go, if you follow through this, right, hypothyroid is going to release TRH. TRH is going to go to the anterior pituitary and release TSH. TSH is going to go to the thyroid, and it's going to cause the thyroid to release T3 and T4. So if T3 and T4 are low quantities, then that tells the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to increase TRH and TSH. Basically, the hypothalamus is saying, hey, you're not making enough T3 and T4. I'm going to trigger you to make some. Anterior pituitary, you're not making enough T3, T4, thyroid. I'm going to tell you to make more. So if your thyroid level is low, it's going to cause these hormones to be increased. Well, once you have a normal or enough T3 and T4, once you're at a good level, it'll go back and it'll shut these hormones off and say, we don't need to make, we did what you told us to do. We've made T3 and T4. Stop sending us the message. So then you won't have TRH or TSH being released from those endocrine organs. But there are some other weird things that can happen. These are antibodies that mimic TSH. So you're not making normal TSH. Your anterior pituitary has shut down TSH, but there's another molecule that comes in and binds your thyroid, and all of a sudden you start churning out T3 and T4. That can cause what we would call hypersecretion. What is hypersecretion? Your thyroid is making too much T3 and T4. We're not talking about how or why it's making it. We just know that it's making more. For hyposecretion, low metabolic rate, tired all the time, cold intolerance, your internal body temperature has dropped lower, and so you can't tolerate the cold as well, and weight gain. So there's a couple of reasons that hypo, so again, hypo is going to be low T3, T4, if you don't have enough iodine. Remember that in order to make T3 and T4, we need iodine. If you don't have enough iodine, you can't make T3 and T4. Also the pituitary, if your anterior pituitary is not releasing TSH, right? If something's wrong with your pituitary and you're not being signaled to make T3 and T4, you're not going to make it. We're going to talk in the case study again about what happens if you have some sort of immune destruction of the thyroid. What if your immune cells are attacking your thyroid? Well, if you destroy thyroid follicular cells, you can't make T3 and T4, right? We can treat this by giving you a synthetic hormone replacement. So this image here is a goiter. Remember how we had the follicular cells? Don't make fun of my artwork, right? We had the follicular cells, and then we had the colloid. So if you don't have enough iodine, the cell is still making that thyroglobulin. The follicular cells are still making the thyroglobulin, but you don't have any iodine to make T3 and T4 to be excreted, so this colloid expands. And it pushes on the thyroid cells, all of the other follicular cells, and it causes this goiter. So you may go look at a container of salt in the cabinet and see that it's iodized salt. So at some point we decided to iodize our salt, 19 turn of the century, maybe a little bit before. We iodized salt, and so now salt has iodine attached to it, so from our diet we're receiving enough salt that this shouldn't be a problem. But think about in other countries where this might be an issue if food sources are not as plentiful, that you could have some issues in obtaining enough iodine, and these goiters would be more common. So our very last slide here, we have calcitonin. Calcitonin is released from these parafollicular cells, right? So stimulus release is high blood calcium. So if your blood calcium levels are high, it's going to trigger the parafollicular cells of the thyroid to release calcitonin. It's going to target bones, bones and kidneys. It's going to tell your kidneys to excrete calcium, and it's going to tell your bones to stop breaking down bone and releasing more calcium into the blood. We've had enough. Don't dump any more in here. We're trying to get rid of the excess that we have. So something to note, if I said, name the 3 hormones that are released from the thyroid. T3, T4, calcitonin. Which 2 hormones are made from the follicular cells? T3, T4. Which hormone is made from the parafollicular cells? Calcitonin. So hopefully that made sense. We're going to go through more hormones as we move through to part 3.